Every year, we have a presentation on Constitution Day. It is mandated by the Department of Education. Congress mandated it a number of years ago. And what it is, it's a way to get people to understand something about a very important document, which is the U.S. Constitution. So, what we do is we just come over here, they provided some PowerPoints, and we come over here and sit down and I talk to you about the Constitution. They want everybody to understand how important this document is to this day, well over 200 years ago. November 17th is the date it was adopted, I believe 1787. Yeah, 1787. Okay, so there's three parts to the Constitution. There's the preamble, the articles, and the amendments. Now, you can easily look online for a copy of the Constitution. If you can't find one, I'll be glad to get it for you. I've got a copy of it on the server here. But it's something we don't think about very much. You hear it bannered about on, different media and things like that. But I don't think many people don't understand what it's all about. The preamble. This ought to be pretty familiar to everybody. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. We've all heard pieces of this before, I'm sure. We the people. There's a lot of talk about that, because the crazy thing about the U.S. is that the people actually are in charge. We vote, and if we don't vote, then we're not in charge. But we vote, and we elect the people that represent us. We are not a democracy. We are a representative democracy. We are in other words, we don't directly make decisions, but we hire the people to make the decisions on our behalf. And if they don't make the decisions we want, then we should boot them out, because they have to stand for re-election. So the preamble, just as the introduction, it frames out kind of what they want the Constitution to be seen as. Of course, the words "we the people" are very critical, because we're not run by a king or a dictator. But the
GPS signal lost.
All the people, the Supreme Court, the President, all the people are mentioned in the Constitution, how we select them, and how, what their roles are, and things like that. So, the Articles of the Constitution is where everything is set out. So that's the main body of the Constitution. So Section 1, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in Congress of the United States, which shall consist of the Senate and House of Representatives. They don't put the President first in this. The Congress is the ones that decide how much money is going to be spent. The House of Representatives comes up with a budget, or comes up with spending recommendations. It's ratified by the Senate and then signed by the President if everybody is in agreement. Section 2 says the House of Representatives are composed by members who are chosen every 2 years. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, maybe relatives, but how many people I've talked to that want to tell you that, oh no, Congress people, the House of Representatives, they're elected for 4 years, they're elected for 6 years. No, they run for re-election every 2 years. It's meant to be, if you don't like them, you can kick them out and try again. That's the whole idea of the House of Representatives, those 2-year terms. So, you have to be at least 25 years old to be member of the House, and have been a citizen for at least 7 years, must live in the state from which he or she is chosen, which that gets a little fuzzy sometimes. And there's been a lot of efforts to, say, term limit the House of Representatives or things like that. They've always been turned down, or just different things, by the Supreme Court, because that's not what the Constitution says. Now, the Senate has 100 members. There are 2 senators for each state. Currently, we have 50 states, so we have 100 senators. Senators are different. Until 1913, senators were not selected by the people. Senators were basically selected by their state, and they picked the 2 people they thought would best represent the state legislatures did. And they sent them to the Senate. But that was changed, and now we directly elect senators. Some people say that's better, that's worse, but that's the way it is. We currently directly elect senators. And senators serve a 6-year term. Now, both the House and the Senate can serve unlimited terms. House, unlimited 2-year terms, the Senate, unlimited 6-year terms. And some of the people have stayed there a long time, and but that's what the Constitution says. Okay, so Section 4 of Article 1 says the state legislatures can determine how the elections are held, both Congress, Senate elections, and to a large degree presidential elections. The state legislature determines when an election is scheduled, how voters can register, and where they can cast their ballots. The House and Senate are each in charge of deciding whether election of one of its own members is legitimate. I don't recall them saying that any of the elections weren't legitimate, certainly in my lifetime. Possibly it's happened. Congress has the power to hear witnesses to help them decide. The House and Senate can establish their own rules, punish members for disorderly behavior, and if 2/3 agree, expel a member. I don't recall them too many times where they've expelled a member, but I think they may have done that with a guy out of New York recently. But there has been several times where the Senate or the House has censured somebody for really just outright egregious behavior, and that has happened. Section 6. Congress is paid for their work by the U.S. Treasury, and Amendment 27 prohibits members from raising their own salary during a given term. So in other words, they can't raise their salary during this term. It has to be next term that they would raise it for the following term. It's always a contentious thing when the Congress people and Senate raise their salaries, because a lot of people are like, well, gee, that's awfully generous of you. But they're not hugely paid. They do come out rich, that's a whole other matter. House Representatives must build Section 7 process when it comes to raising, spending money. So, as I said earlier, if I'm the president and I want to spend a lot of money on something, I'm gonna go to the House, and they're gonna come up with something we could agree on, both not just how to spend the money, but how to get the money to spend. In other words, taxes. So the Senate then goes to the Senate, and they offer their changes, which they always will. They'll put their items in there. Then it goes to the president for a signature. But only the House Representatives can introduce a bill that involves taxes. kind of an interesting quirk on it. Section 8, Article 1, provides the powers Congress in great detail. These powers are limited to those listed, and those are necessary and proper to carry them out. All lawmakers, I'm sorry I'm reading this, but I want to be specific. All lawmaking powers are left to the states. The first Congress concerned that limited nature of the federal government was not clear enough. The original Constitution later adopted Amendment 10, which reserves the states to the people all the powers not specifically granted by the federal government. We'll talk about some of those amendments. In other words, we were formed where they wanted a very limited government, and they felt that too much was left for interpretation. So the 10th Amendment hopefully filled in a lot of the blanks. Okay, Section 9 specifically prohibits Congress from legislating in certain areas. First clause, the Constitution bars Congress from banning the importation of slaves before 1808. Well, that really wasn't a very good one. Section 10, Article 1, Section 10 limits the powers of the state. States may not enter into a treaty with a foreign nation since the power is given to the president with the advice consent of 2/3%. So in other words, states can't do certain things. States can't, let's say, go to China and make some deal with China that hasn't been ratified by the Senate. You just can't do it. And also, not that this would be a problem today especially, but states can't grant nobility to somebody. In other words, you know, like in England, they have, you know, Sir somebody, you know, knighting people and all that. States aren't allowed to do that because we fought a war to get out from under that sort of thing. Section 1, Article 2. Okay, Article 2, Section 1, establishes the president has the power to run the executive branch of the government. This section, later modified by amendments 12 and 25, outlaw who is eligible to serve as president, establishes the electoral college, the means by which presidents and vice presidents are elected, and authorizes Congress to determine who will replace the president and vice president should they be unable to serve out the term of office. Now, there's been a lot of movement around, you know, the powers of the presidency and things like that. So that's always something, remember, there's supposed to be 3 branches of government. The Congress, which is House of Representatives, Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court. And they're all supposed to be co-equals. So one's no more powerful than the other, except for the fact that the Supreme Court gets to decide that. So the president serves not only as the head of the executive branch, but also as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, including state and national guards when they're called to serve with the federal armed forces. So the president's the commander-in-chief. He or she can declare war on anybody that they want. But if Congress doesn't go along with it, you have to ask the question, who's going to pay for that war? So it has to be an agreement that we're going to go fight a war, because the Congress will have to come up with money to pay for all the bullets and troops and things like that. As chief executive, the president runs the different executive agencies like Department of Treasury, Department of Health and Human Services. He has the power to pardon or set free any person who has committed a federal crime, except in the case of impeachment. So if they can impeach, if he gets impeached, he can't pardon himself for that. All right, I want to sit down, beg your pardon, but I can't stand that. All right, during his or her term, the president must report to Congress about how things are going in the country. Every president from Jefferson to Taft fulfilled this duty with a written statement submitted to Congress. In 1913, President Wilson resumed the President Washington's practice of directly addressing a joint session of Congress. This State of the Union speech, a tradition which continues to this day, usually occurs in January or February of each year. So I don't know if you've ever bothered to watch a State of the Union address. They're not usually the most riveting TV out there. However, it is something that the president's gonna stand up there and give a wish list of what they want and give a list of their accomplishments, that sort of thing. And both the Senate and the House of Representatives are there in the hall watching this. And you get into some political antics and things like that, which just goes with how things work, I guess. But I don't watch it every year, but I've watched it several years, you know, just, it's kind of entertaining to a degree. And then, of course, both sides will get in there and make their talking points afterwards. All right, so the Constitution, Section 4 of Article 2. The Constitution provides that the President, Vice President, and other federal officers can be removed from office upon impeachment by the House and convicted by the Senate of treason, bribery, and other serious crimes. The process was begun 3 times in U.S. history against the President, against Richard Nixon, Andrew Johnson. Nixon, although he resigned before Congress could not be formally acted, President Clinton. Add 2 more to that. Trump was impeached twice. But if you're impeached, it doesn't mean you have to leave office unless you're convicted by the Senate. And that never happened. So, Article 3. Article 3 establishes the federal court system. Now, this is where we get into, you know, the federal courts are really important because ultimately it leads to the Supreme Court. If things go that far. All right, so the first section creates the U.S. Supreme Court as the federal system's highest court. The Supreme Court has final say on matters of federal law that come before it. Today, the U.S. Supreme Court has 9 justices who are appointed by the President with the approval of the Senate. The federal courts will decide arguments over how to interpret the Constitution. All laws passed by Congress and our nation's rights and responsibilities and agreements with other nations. In addition, federal courts can hear disputes that may arise between the states, between citizens of different states, and between states and the federal government. So, the Supreme Court only decides whether something is constitutional or unconstitutional, whether it fits within the Constitution or it does not. So, if there's a dispute between the state of California and a person or a group, they will go, first of all, to the federal court. Depending on the verdict, it may be appealed to a higher court, and then ultimately, then it goes to what they call whichever court of appeals, Circuit Court of Appeals. California's has the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals. So if it goes all the way to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, depending on the outcome of it, it's probably going to go to the Supreme Court. If the parties aren't satisfied. Whichever one lost in that appeal, now the Supreme Court doesn't have to listen to it. They don't have to. They can just say, no, we're not going to hear it. And so whatever the judgment by the Court of Appeals was stands. It's all very complicated, and you hear a lot about this stuff in the news. And frankly, it's there's a lot of stuff going on right now that takes sort of front and center of this. So, federal courts will decide arguments over how to interpret constitutional laws passed. Okay, we went through that. Section 3, treason is the only crime specifically defined in the Constitution. According to Article 3, Section 3, a person is guilty of treason if he or she goes to war against the United States or or gives aid and comfort to an enemy. He or she does not have to physically pick up a weapon and fight in combat against U.S. troops. Actively helping the enemy by passing along classified information or supplying weapons, for example, can lead to a charge of treason. Treason, the reason that this is the case is that treason is considered to be the worst crime you can commit, because you're not trying to kill someone, you're basically trying to kill your whole country, or certainly subject them to rule by a dictator or something like that. So it's a big deal that that's the only thing that was specified in the Constitution. And it's occasionally done today. It's kind of hard to put your finger on, exactly what is treasonous, things like that. So that's something that has to be decided by the courts. Section 1, Article 4. Section 1, the meaning of it is to ensure that states respect and honor the state's laws and court orders of other states, even when their own laws are different. For example, if citizens in New Jersey marry, divorce, or adopt children in New Jersey, Florida must recognize these actions as valid, even if the marriage or divorce would not have been possible under Florida law. Similarly, if a court in one state orders a person to pay money or stop certain behavior, the courts in the other states must recognize and enforce that state's order. So this really came into sharp focus when states started allowing gay marriages. Because if one state allows gay marriage, according to this, it has to be recognized in all states. And there was a Supreme Court verdict that came down that said just that. Yeah, that's exactly what it means. So that's why gay marriage is legal in all 50 states now, is because of this ruling. Okay, Article 4, Section 2 guarantees states cannot discriminate against citizens of other states. States must give people from other states the same fundamental rights as it gives its own citizens. For example, Arizona cannot prohibit New Mexico residents from traveling, owning property, or working in Arizona. Nor can the state impose substantially different taxes on residents and non-residents. But certain non-residents, such as giving state residents a right to buy or a hunting license at lower cost, are permitted. In other words, yeah, you can give your own state citizens a break on different things, but you can't, it's a fine line apparently, you can't go crazy, say that, if you live in the state of Arizona, you could, in this case, pay $50 for a hunting license, and if you're a citizen of California, might pay $5,000, something like that. So, again, I don't know how often this is cited as being unconstitutional. That's really what it means. Okay, and same as with out-of-state tuition for college, just different things like that. You can reward your own citizens, but it can only go so far. Congress can admit new states into the Union, but a single state cannot create a new state within its boundaries. For example, the state of New York cannot make New York City a separate state. In addition, two states or parts of states, for instance, Oregon and Idaho, or Wilmington, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cannot become states without the consent of the various state legislatures and Congress. Although an original version of the Constitution included the requirement that each new state join the Union as on an equal footing with other states, the language was removed before the document was approved. Nonetheless, Congress has always granted new states rights equal to those of existing states. There's an interesting thing. There's a movement prior to World War II in Northern California and Southern Oregon to create something called the state of Jefferson. And it looked like it was going to pass. It looked like the Congress was going to approve it. But then World War II broke out. Then Pearl Harbor was bombed. And they just never got back around to it. Because Northern California, extreme Northern California, and extreme in Southern Oregon just don't feel like they belong to either state. So it's just kind of an interesting story, the state of Jefferson that never was. Okay, Section 4, the provision known as the Guarantee Clause. It's attributed to James Madison, has not been widely interpreted, but scholars think it ensures that each state be run as a representative democracy as opposed to a monarchy. That's kind of, that should be pretty obvious, but again, we weren't that far away from when the British ruled the US, so they were really concerned about that monarchy stuff, kings. So, dictatorship, where one individual or group of individuals controls the government. Courts, however, have been reluctant to specify what exactly Republican form of government means, leaving that decision exclusively to Congress. So I mentioned that earlier. We are not a democracy. We have democratic rights where we vote for things, people, what have you. But we're a republic. In other words, although they don't define it, that means that we have representatives in the Congress, in the Senate, and in the various state legislatures that we vote for, that we feel will have our best interests at heart. All right, section 5. Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose an amendment to the Constitution, or on application of the legislature of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a constitution for proposing amendments. It's a constitutional convention, by the way, for proposing amendments which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution, but ratified by the legislature and 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, and as part, the other mode of ratification may be processed by Congress, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 108 shall in any manner affect the first or fourth clauses. Okay, basically, what does this say? It says that we could amend the Constitution. It's been amended a bunch of times, but it's really tough to amend it because they wanted it to be tough to amend. If it's gonna be an amendment to the Constitution, it better be something really super important, because you have to get 2/3 majorities, I believe, and the vast majority of states have to agree with it. So there hasn't been a constitutional amendment that's passed in a very, very long time. All right, Article 6 is the supremacy clause. It says that when state law is in conflict with federal law must prevail, because the great number of federal and state laws, many of which deal with the same or similar topics, there have been many lawsuits claiming that state laws conflict with federal laws and are therefore invalid. In these lawsuits, the Supreme Court generally looks at whether Congress has established a national regulatory scheme, or if states cannot regulate in that area. Famous thing happened when we came up with the ban on venting for EPA purposes, Section 608, which many of you have, or all of you will be getting, which is the EPA regulates EPA regulates whether or not you can use different refrigerants, all these different things. They stopped the production and sales of CFCs, and so Arizona passed a law saying, nah, manufacture all the CFCs you want. You don't need any Section 608. You can vent all you want. Knock yourself out. Well, why'd they do that? Well, they knew it couldn't possibly be done, but they did it for political reasons, because I guess it sounded good to a lot of the constituents. But of course, you couldn't do that because it violated the federal regulatory agencies' bans. So there's been things like this over the years. A lot of times they're not even serious about it. They just do it, again, for political gain. All right, Article 7, Section 1. All the states except Rhode Island held conventions to ratify the Constitution. North Carolina's convention adjourned without voting on the document. Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution in 1787, and New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it on June 21st, 1788. This is kind of floating around out there for a while. The new government began with convening the first federal Congress on March 4th, 1789. Both North Carolina in 1789, Rhode Island in 1790 ratified the Constitution after Congress passed the Bill of Rights and sent it to the states for ratification. All right, so that's the body of the Constitution right there. I know it gets kind of arduous. Okay, so the Constitution is a handwritten document which is over 200 years old. We just found another copy of apparently the original Constitution in somebody's file cabinet somewhere in some state, which is probably, there's no telling what it's worth. But you can see the original Constitution. If you visit Washington D.C., they have it under glass and very controlled lighting, but you can actually see the original Constitution. This is a living document. It protects our rights and freedom. Why do they call it a living document? Well, it's a living document in that it can always be amended. We can always, something that 240 years ago they hadn't thought of, we could always amend it. So, again, we have it for a long time, but we still. Does the Constitution give your rights and liberties? No, it guarantees them. So, the Constitution guarantees the rights and liberties. And it's, you know, some people would say that the military enforces that one. You know, because it's, we have to have enforcement, things like that, but really the federal government has to go along with it. If the Supreme Court says something, they have to go along with it. What constitutes the Bill of Rights? It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And these were seen as being kind of radical at the time, but they didn't think they could get them passed with the original Constitution, so they waited till the original Constitution was sort of settled, and then they went in and did the Bill of Rights. So it's very interesting. The first 10 amendments are extremely interesting. How long did it take to frame the Constitution? It was drafted in fewer than 100 working days. Can you believe that? Washington can't do anything in 100 days. They managed to do that. The father of the Constitution has always been assumed to be James Madison of Virginia. The Bill of Rights isn't included in the original document, added 2 years later, 10 amendments. First Amendment. Hopefully you will know what the First Amendment is. Freedom of speech and press. The First Amendment allows citizens to express and be exposed to a wide range of opinions and views. It was intended to ensure the free exchange of ideas, even if the ideas were unpopular. Okay, so what does the First Amendment say? Congress shall not infringe on your right of free speech. Congress. Doesn't mean that somebody in the street can't, you know, tell you to shut up. It just means that Congress shall not infringe on it. But free speech has been really a widely debated thing for the last several years. And it seems to me the Constitution is pretty clear on that. But people can disagree and argue about it. Second Amendment, I think we're all aware of that one. Right of the people to bear arms. Principal debate around the Second Amendment concerns whether or not the right to use and buy guns belongs to individuals or only to a militia. Although the courts generally have held that the right applies to individuals, they have permitted the government to limit some rights of gun manufacturers, owners, and sellers. This is a very touchy subject. We've got a lot of laws in California right now that are headed to the Supreme Court just on this subject. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all turns out. Third Amendment. It's intended to protect citizens' rights, the ownership and use of their property without intrusion by the government. The drafters of the Constitution, like many of the colonists, were resentful of laws in place before the Revolutionary War that allowed British soldiers to take over private homes for their own use. That was one of the big things that actually helped trigger the Revolutionary War with things like that. So it's a big thing that they wanted to pass that in the Bill of Rights. So the government can't just take your property without compensating you. That's why, if your house is in the way of where they wanna build a freeway, they can force you to sell your house, but it would be at fair market value. And according to my brother, who worked for years for the city of Los Angeles, he said, you better hope that they do want that, because they usually pay way more than market value. Thus, the amendment bars the government from forcing individuals to provide lodging to soldiers in their homes, except during war, in the interest of national security, by overriding individual right of private property. I don't know, that might have been done during the Civil War, not really sure, but I know it has not been done since then. People give up their homes to soldiers. Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. This is a big deal because years ago, it brought us the fact that the police had to give us our Miranda rights before we're arrested, things like that. So the Fourth Amendment is a big deal. Protection against unreasonable search and seizures. The Fourth Amendment protects people against unreasonable searches and seizures by government officials. Search can mean anything from frisking by a police officer to a blood test, search of an individual's home or a car. A seizure occurring when the government takes control of an individual or something in his or her possession. Items are seized, often used as evidence when the individual is charged with a crime. Again, something that is always in play. Did the police overstep their bounds when they did this or did that? So it's a tricky thing. Violation of the Fourth Amendment has been a real protection against government overreach by doing just that. Fifth Amendment. We've heard a lot about this one, right? Meaning grand jury protection. The Fifth Amendment requires that serious federal crimes, criminal charges be started by a grand jury, a group of citizens who hear the evidence from a prosecutor about potential crimes. It's rooted in English common law. Its basic purpose is to provide a fair method for beginning criminal proceedings against those accused of committing crimes. Grand jury charges can be issued against anyone except members of the military who are instead subjected to courts-martial in the military justice system. So this comes into focus with a lot of current events. Sixth Amendment, right to a jury trial. In a criminal case, the government prosecutors or charges a defendant with violation of criminal law and begins proceeding, bail hearings, arraignments, and trials, to provide that the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's why you have to be, in a criminal case, convicted beyond a reasonable doubt. Seventh Amendment. The Seventh Amendment extends the rights to jury trial to federal civil cases, such as car accidents, disputes between corporations for breach of contract, or most criminal or employment disputes in civil cases. In civil cases, the person bringing the lawsuit, the plaintiff, seeks money damages or a court order preventing the person being sued, the defendant, from engaging in certain conduct. To win, the plaintiff must prove his or her case by a preponderance of the evidence. Remember, criminal is beyond a reasonable doubt. Now it's the preponderance of the evidence. Well, I think it's 51% towards that person, or 49 towards the other. I guess the 51%. You know, it's something like that. It's how you would judge the evidence. Eighth Amendment. No excessive bail. The first portion of the Eighth Amendment concerns bail, money paid by a defendant in a criminal case in exchange for his or her release from jail before trial. Bail is returned to the defendant when he or she appears in trial, but is forfeited to the government if he or she does not appear. In this way, bail provides an incentive for the defendant to remain in the area and participate in the trial. course, this is something that has also been in the news over the last few years. What is excessive bail or bail at all? Ninth Amendment. Ninth Amendment is a constitutional safety net intended to make clear that individuals have other fundamental rights in addition to those listed in the first 8 amendments. Some of the framers had raised doubts that because it was impossible to list every fundamental right, it would be dangerous to list just some of them. For example, the right to free speech or the right to bear arms, and so forth, for fear of suggesting that the list was complete. So in other words, it says, well, we can also throw other stuff in there. Not just the first 8, but we can also put other stuff in there. 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment was intended, included within the Bill of Rights to further define the balance of power between the federal government and the states. The amendment says that the federal government has only those powers specifically granted by the Constitution. These powers include the power to declare war, collect taxes, regulate interstate business activities, and others that are listed in the articles. All right, so an additional 17 amendments have been made to the Constitution. Most recent change was 1992. So it's been a minute or two since we've had another amendment added to the Constitution. After the text of the Constitution had been agreed upon, Jacob Shallis, the Assistant Clerk of the Pennsylvania State Assembly, was the pen man who wrote the document prior to signing. All right, so just in closing, the Constitution has always been talked about. Some people believe it's an outdated document, it has no relevance, but I'd like to remind everybody that it's been the thing that's held the United States together in check and, you know, held the powers of the different branches of government, you know, made them stay in their own lane for way over 200 years. And it's kind of hard to argue with that kind of a success. Is it perfect? No document is perfect. And we do always have the ability to change it if there's enough support for doing so. So I hope this really gives you a better understanding of the U.S. Constitution. If you didn't already understand it, most people don't actually. And so that's why they passed this requirement. Congress passed it, and then the Department of Education enforces it. So we have to do this every year, have to make Constitution Day, you know, presented to the students, and I hope you got something out of it. I hope it had some meaning for you. So, that's it.